This teenage peasant girl claimed God himself was speaking to her, and it led her straight into the fire. A charred stake, cold ashes, an abandoned sword left behind in an empty square. How did a teenage peasant girl end up burning here, condemned as a heretic by her own people? What you are about to learn will completely change the way you see this simple farm girl from a poor and forgotten little village in France. She led hardened, battle-scarred soldiers straight into the fight, carried her white banner through fire and smoke, and somehow changed the fate of an entire kingdom. Around 1425, in a poor, muddy French village, a young peasant girl grew up spinning wool and herding animals, expecting nothing more from her hard, simple life. Then, one ordinary day out in the fields, she suddenly froze. She swore that voices sent from God himself had begun speaking directly to her. War was tearing the kingdom apart. Nearby villages burned and terrified families fled past her home, carrying everything they still owned with them. Night after night she knelt alone and listened, becoming certain that heaven itself had chosen her for one impossible mission, to save France. So in 1428, this teenage girl made a choice no one expected. She gathered her things, dressed as a man, and left her home behind. Alone, she rode across a dangerous, war-torn land toward the only man who could give her a real army, the uncrowned Prince of France. Against all odds, the ragged peasant girl finally reached the royal court in 1429 and was brought before the desperate, uncrowned Prince of France himself. He decided to test her, quietly hiding among his richly dressed nobles, yet she walked straight through the whole crowd and bowed low before exactly the right man. She spoke with such fierce and burning conviction that the doubting prince finally agreed to give this teenage peasant girl a real army of her own to command. They wrapped her slender body in gleaming steel plate armor, placed a heavy sword into her hand, and raised her bright white banner high above the camp. Hardened, battle-scarred soldiers openly scoffed at the mad idea of following a teenage girl into a brutal, bloody war they were already slowly losing. But the moment she raised her white banner and calmly gave her orders, their mocking laughter slowly faded into something that looked almost like awe. And so, at the head of her army, she rode out across the war-torn land, marching straight toward the besieged city of Orléans. By 1429, the vital city of Orléans had been trapped under a brutal English siege for months, and its starving people were losing all hope. Then the armored girl rode straight through the gates, and the desperate townspeople crowded around her, suddenly daring to believe they might be saved. The cautious old commanders wanted to sit and wait behind the walls, but she furiously demanded that they strike the enemy siege forts at once, without any more delay. So the entire French army stormed the towering wooden forts, dragging their heavy ladders up the walls under a deadly, screaming storm of arrows, stones, and thick choking smoke. An arrow slammed deep into her shoulder, and she dropped to the ground, yet only moments later she forced herself back up and drove her stunned soldiers forward again. Truly shaken by the wounded girl who simply would not die, the English abandoned their burning forts and retreated, and at last the long siege of the city was broken. News of the impossible miracle at Orléans raced across the whole country, and ordinary people everywhere began to whisper that God himself had sent her. With Orléans saved, she made a bold new promise. She would march the prince deep into enemy territory to crown him a true king. By July 1429, they reached the great cathedral city of Reims, and cheering crowds flooded the streets to greet their coming king. Inside the vast, towering cathedral, before all the gathered nobles and the solemn clergy, the trembling young prince slowly knelt down at the sacred golden altar. The heavy golden crown was carefully lowered onto his bowed head, and in that single sacred moment, he finally became Charles VII, the rightful king of France. The simple peasant girl knelt low before her new king with tears streaming down her face, for her impossible holy mission from God was now truly fulfilled. She stepped outside to a massive, roaring crowd that now looked upon her as a living saint, sent down from heaven itself to rescue them all. At barely 18 years old, the poor girl from a forgotten village now stood at the very peak of her power, fame, and glory. After the coronation, the young king grew cautious and hesitant, while she still burned to keep fighting and drive the enemy out of France completely. But when she threw her tired soldiers against the massive stone walls of Paris, the assault failed, and for the first time her legend began to crack. A sharp crossbow bolt tore deep into her leg, and her own men had to drag her back as the whole desperate attack collapsed into a bitter and bloody defeat. And far worse still, the very king she had crowned with her own hands now signed a quiet truce with the enemy, coldly abandoning the girl who saved his throne. In the year 1430, while bravely defending the town of Compiègne with only a small band of loyal men, she was suddenly cut off and surrounded by enemy soldiers. They violently dragged her down from her horse into the cold mud, and just like that, the fearless girl who had terrified whole armies was finally a helpless prisoner. Her enemies sold her in chains to the English for a heavy bag of gold, and now her long, terrible nightmare was only just beginning. Judge after judge threw cunning, twisted trap questions at her for weeks. Yet the poor, unschooled farm girl answered every single one of them with startling wisdom. Alone in the freezing dark, exhausted, chained and afraid, she still knelt down every single night and quietly prayed to the God who had chosen her. They dragged her before the cruel instruments of torture, hoping that raw animal terror would finally break her unshakable will and force a confession. Worn down and utterly terrified of the burning flames, she trembled, gave in, and made a shaky mark on a paper she could never even read. But only days later she took back her fear, defiantly put on the soldier's clothes once more, and quietly accepted the terrible fate coming for her. Broken by fear and worn down by the endless trial, she finally gave in and signed away her holy voices to save her own life. But days later, back in her cold cell, she put the forbidden soldier's clothes on once more, quietly choosing death over living a lie. On the 30th of May, 1431, in the market square of Rouen, English guards led the chained teenage girl out through a vast and silent crowd. A gentle monk pressed a small wooden cross into her hands, and she held it close, whispering a final prayer, strangely calm and unafraid. They bound her to the tall wooden stake as thousands of people from all across Normandy watched in heavy, uneasy silence. Then the flames rose, thick smoke swallowed the square, and the young woman who had crowned a king was gone at just 19. When it was over, only cold ash and a charred stake remained in the empty Rouen square, and even her enemies stood shaken. News of the execution spread across France in the summer of 1431, and in towns like Paris and Tours, ordinary people wept openly in the streets. Fearing she would become a holy relic, the English scattered her ashes into the river Seine, hoping the world would simply forget her. But France never forgot. In quiet village churches, peasants lit candles and secretly prayed to the girl they already believed was a saint. Nearly 25 years later, in 1456, a new church trial in Rouen finally overturned the verdict and declared her completely innocent. Over the centuries, her legend only grew, her armored image rising in stained glass and stone across the whole of France. Finally, in 1920, almost 500 years after her death, the Catholic Church declared the peasant girl a true saint. She was just 19, unable to read or write, yet this farm girl changed the course of a 100-year war and the fate of a nation. Today, Joan of Arc stands eternal, the peasant who heard God, saved a kingdom, and burned as a heretic only to rise as a saint. 6 centuries later, statues of Joan of Arc still rise across France, where people from all over the world come to honor the fearless peasant girl who became a legend. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more legendary stories from history's darkest and greatest figures.